Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Solutions podcast. And this month I am here with Milly Carmichael. And so, welcome, Milly. Hey, nice
Hi.
to see you. So, we have recently been co facilitating on a Think Like a Tree course together and talking about the natural principles. And be really interesting to kind of explore an area which Milly's been working a lot in non-violent communication. But first of all, Milly, hello, and who are you?
Hi, Nicola. Thank you for inviting me onto the podcast. So I am Milly Carmichael. This is a tricky question actually about who am I or sort of what am I doing now. So I'm in recent years, I've been working in public health in the field of food insecurity, but I left a few months ago. I'm going back to exploring self-employment again. So previously, I've done a lot of work around training facilitation for many years in a number of guises with a number of different hats on. So I'm going back to that now. And my intention is to do a lot more of this work. So the kind of work that we were doing on the course together around Think Like a Tree, around nature connectedness, but a thread that's run through a lot of that work for quite a few years now for me is this body of work around compassionate or non-violent communication. So so I'm looking to do more of it really now that that opportunity arises again. So.
And the world really needs for us to learn how to compassionately communicate, because as we can see, humans are not doing a very good job at the moment. So maybe you could just tell us first, where the bit of the history of non-violent communication, or NVC for short. So yeah, where did it all kind of start?
Well, so my understanding of the beginning of this was it really came from a body of work by a man called Marshall Rosenberg. So he was a psychologist, and he was really keen to understand the dynamic of a lot of the way we communicate. And he talked about this idea that there's a lot of violence in the way that we often communicate, and that's not as simple as kind of threatening people or using swearing and that kind of aggression in our language, but the way we compare ourselves to others. For instance, we have a lot of language which describes how we're not as good as or we're better than other people, how we kind of diagnose people. I'm sure we've all done that. The usual example I often give on training courses is the diagnoses we use when someone cuts us up at a roundabout. Right, so we could all imagine the kinds of things that it's just kind of a gut feeling that we just put out there, and we judge people. So there's a lot of language around what other people deserve, for instance, deserving praise or deserving punishment, and we might turn that language in on ourselves also. So he was really exploring that and wondering how we could communicate differently. And what he basically came up with was this idea that we all have basic universal human needs. There are quite a lot of them, but they tend to be around those basic things. We have a need for food, for water, for shelter, for warmth. But once those basic needs are met, we all have needs around connection with other people, with the world around us, needs around feeling that we belong to something that's bigger than us, that we're contributing somehow, that we have needs around joy and togetherness, and all these kinds of things. And basically, what he was saying was that all we're trying to do in any moment is to get these human needs met. And so there are lots of them, but in any given moment, there'll be a few that are kind of more present for us. And our feelings are a way of telling us whether or not these needs have been met or not. So when we feel big uncomfortable feelings like sadness or anger or frustration or those kind of things, that's basically us being told that somewhere under there is a need that's not being met. And when we feel those feelings that are more comfortable, so joy and curiosity and awe, and when we're laughing, all of those things, they're a clear indication that we have some basic human needs that are being met. Okay, that's fundamentally the idea. What we tend to do when we're communicating with people is we tend to communicate at that level of judging other people's behavior, rather than being curious about actually how are they feeling in that moment, and underneath that, what need is trying to be met for them. So what nonviolent communication invites us to do is slow down and really listen to what people are trying to communicate about, what needs are present for them, what's alive for them in any particular moment. So this was kind of back in the 80s, really, that he was doing this work, and the model of nonviolent communication was used as the basis. It's still used as the basis for work around things like truth and reconciliation after, the South African apartheid and so on. So big peacemaking work across the world has been based on these nonviolent communication processes or strategies, if you like. But equally, we can all learn how to do this. We don't all need to be global peacemakers. We can be peacemakers, solution finders in our own relationships, in our own domestic circumstances.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's something that we often just don't think about. What needs do we have? And if you were to kind of, write a list of what your needs are, you probably wouldn't get anywhere near to the amount of needs that are officially on the little cards.
Yeah.
For
I mentioned I have got them here.
Oh,
in blue Peter style. Here's some I collected earlier. Okay. Well, I've got a little blurry thing on, but basically these they're card decks. They're card decks. So just like you would have, they're the same size as playing cards, and they come from nvcuk.com. I'm sure we can put a link to if people are interested in this. And so there are two sets of cards: one needs and one feelings. On each card there is just one word, and it is a whole deck of cards. So this is a big old vocabulary. And what I really like about this as a resource is that it can really help. It's certainly helped me over the years to properly slow myself down in those moments where I've had communication with other people, or indeed with myself. This also applies to that kind of internal dialogue or internal narrative that we have about ourselves. It's often quite self-critical. That we can use this idea of naming the feelings, actually, giving them a name, voicing it, calling it what it is, and then being curious about where did that feeling come from, what need was trying to be met for me in that moment. And yeah, they're really, really helpful. I've certainly found them very useful, as I say, to slow things down and just really reflect on what's properly going on. Then you can go back to a situation and kind of go, can we try again with that? Because I think this is what was really going on for me. And then we can also be curious about what's going on for the other person, because this isn't just about us getting our needs met. It's about getting to a place where there's a much better chance that everybody can get their needs met without that kind of sort of discomfort of just compromising. Do you know what I mean? Because that doesn't actually ever really satisfy anybody. So it's trying to get beyond that. Yeah.
I mean, we all know that if you lined up 20 people and gave them the same situation, they would react in a different way.
Absolutely.
We have a difficult confrontational situation. Some people like water off the duck's back or whatever. Other people immediately kind of go in for the kill.
Yes.
And we all can have exactly the same issue and respond to it in a different way. And so I think any of these tools that can help us look at, how do we communicate? We're not taught at school. Wouldn't it be wonderful if as kids we were actually taught how to communicate? And this thing about feelings is not this kind of woo-woo thing of, let's not talk about our feelings, or actually what are feelings? And the only feelings really I know are, sorrow and grief and anger and love. And how many more are there?
Yeah.
And seeing the difference. And I like to hear it when you were talking about needs. It's like, we don't have a need for chocolate or gin and tonic.
Yeah. So we use we use these cards a lot when we're sort of introducing people to these ideas on training courses and things. And so we lay all the cards out on the table, and there is usually a kind of people going, "Wow, there's a lot of cards. That's a lot of words." So it can take a little while to let that sink in. And you can see that you can kind of cluster them together with words that are similar. But this is the joy of being able to extend our vocabulary about how to communicate these things, because there are subtle differences, I think, between these things, both around the feelings and around the needs. And so we put all the needs on the table, and then I will just say, does anybody see a card there that says chocolate, or a large gin and tonic, or an expensive holiday to the Maldives? No, it's not there, because those things aren't needs. We say they are, but that's kind of shortcut again in our language. So they're meeting some needs. So then we might have a conversation about, well, actually, what needs could be met by chocolate or a large gin and tonic? So we might say, well, there's a need for sustenance. So I'm hungry, I'm going to eat something. But that might be something about a need for celebration. We often use chocolate and sweet things to help us to celebrate. It might be about intimacy, that we really associate chocolate with kind of romance and being close to people. It might be something about restoring relationship with people, that kind of getting back to some equilibrium. So it's almost like a peace offering. So chocolate it's not a need. We don't need chocolate, but we do need what chocolate can do for us, in the same way, we can say the same about sort of holidays or whatever it might be. So one of the things around how we communicate using nonviolent communication is this idea that we observe first without judgment. I'll come back to that in a minute, because that's also a bit of a challenge. So we observe without judgment. We express what we're feeling, not what we're thinking or diagnosing people with. We talk about our needs and not these strategies to meet needs. And then we would make a request of another person, or of ourselves, actually, and not a demand. Okay, so what that sounds like when it comes out, it sounds a little bit scripted, but there's a structure to it. So this idea of when XYZ happened, or when I heard that thing, I felt whatever you felt, because what was important to me was, or what I needed was. And then a request sounds something like, so would you be willing to? Or I would prefer it if. Okay, so then we kind of describe what it is that we'd rather have happening. And it sounds a bit clunky when we first start to practice this, but it really helps to just kind of take the heat out of potentially confrontational situations, I think. It really gets to kind of where we are with these needs and feelings. And then we can also be curious about what's happening, as I say, with someone else. So I wonder if, when that happened, I wonder if you were feeling, because perhaps you needed, and maybe it would be easier for you if XYZ happened. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, it is. It's
yeah.
a new way of communicating. It's not new, it's been
Yeah.
around for a while. And some people know about it, but most people don't. And, we can see right now, we are in this total polycrisis, meta-crisis world of wars and nastiness, and a lot of this boils down to the fact that we aren't able to communicate. We're very much in that I'm right, you're wrong, my way's the right way, yours. We're more and more into echo chambers where we can keep backing up those beliefs of right and wrong and pointing the finger at these certain individuals that will not be named. And do we think about, well, actually, what's going on for them? What is making them actually make these decisions, which to some of us can seem like, how could you do that? How could you say that without really knowing what their underlying story is of, like, what's their life history, what's going on for them, what are their needs that are not being met, and how are they feeling? I mean, who knows what Donald Trump is feeling? It's, we just don't know really what's going on for people and what's making them act in the way that they are. So, getting us to really stop and start listening to our language, because, I think it's very common. It's like, you made me feel like this, or,
Yeah.
this idea that somebody else is making you feel or making you angry. It's like, no, we make that choice of how we feel. Yes, we're being triggered by
Yeah.
another person,
Yeah, for sure.
but
Yeah,
how do we deal with that?
that's a really big thing. Actually, that language about you made me. If you hadn't done that, I wouldn't have done XYZ. So, and we do it actually, even when we're using that language, we start pointing. We almost can't help ourselves that we start, waving fingers about. And that idea that you made me feel a thing, it just isn't true. I'm just going to say that it isn't true that people make us feel something. There is truth in other people's behavior being perhaps calculated to have a high chance of pushing your buttons so you feel a thing, but there isn't a guarantee in that. And if we can get to a place where we understand our needs and what tends to, as you say, could trigger, I'm not sure if that's always the word I like to use, but that idea that it sort of stimulates something in us. It is, when we talk about our buttons have been pushed, that's quite a good turn of phrase, because these are bruises, if you like. They're tender spots for us. They're needs that aren't being met now, or something's happened that reminds us of a time when a need was profoundly unmet for us. And that's uncomfortable. So what comes up is a wash of really uncomfortable feeling. And if in that moment we are able to be compassionate to ourselves in that moment, if we can just pause long enough to just hold that space, it's like, what is going on for me? Where is this coming from? How do I need to look after myself right now? If we can create the space to do that, it enables us to not escalate a situation. And I think we've talked about this before. This isn't a magic wand. This doesn't mean that we go through life never falling out with anyone, never having conflict. In fact, in a sense, it welcomes conflict, because it's an invitation for us to find a way through it together, kind of side by side. And we often learn a lot about ourselves and other people in that process. Conflict isn't to be avoided. I think it's to be worked through with some good tools. Yeah. So I'll probably lose my thread there, but I'll leave that hanging for a minute.
It's just, we're looking at the big picture of, we've got these world leaders right now who are making a decision. And, how could this look if they were able to communicate in a different way? So, I mean, how do we even start the process of enabling a different kind of communication? Because quite often we've got these, people, two people in extremely powerful positions, and they're not even prepared to communicate with the other. So, it's great to kind of imagine, well, what if, we found a solution to communicate and we were able to move past this, are we able to as humans? Or is this like an innate way that humans, some people are, oh yeah, humans are all about, violence and suffering. And, some people believe that. That's part of human nature.
Yeah.
So, or can we go past that and evolve to a place where we can actually live in harmony with, other humans? So how do you see that looking?
I think we've learned. I think we've been taught well over many generations to have kind of locked ourselves off from this expression of feelings. There's definitely something in there about how we gender that, but that's probably for another conversation. And so therefore, how you value it. So we have gendered feelings as feminine, and we have largely not valued the feminine. Okay, Just going to put that out there. That's a longer conversation to have. But I think there's something very strong in that dynamic. We've also allied that kind of feelings thing with kind of nature and wildness somehow. We have also not valued that either. So there's this sort of this bundle of stuff that gets wrapped up together that we then don't value. And much of our political and power systems are kind of the opposite of that, and try to be as opposite as possible in that kind of dynamic. So, but it is possible. It's absolutely possible. So Marshall Rosenberg was doing this work, was using this in Palestine, talking to Palestinians and Israelis and bringing people together. He didn't stop the national conflict because one person is never going to be able to do that. But he definitely brought families together across that divide. He created circumstances where people could hear each other's pain without it then escalating into, but what about me? But what about me? Because that, I think that's what we see. This kind of tit for tat kind of idea, a complete kind of incapacity, because there is so much pain, an incapacity to hear the pain of another person who's on the other side because you're already too full of your own. And if you can't hear each other at that level, all we will ever have is a dynamic of, what about me? What about me? But what about me? Okay, I'm so angry now, I want you to shut up, so I'm going to shoot you. You shot somebody I care about. I've got to shoot you back. And in fact, it hurt me so much, I'm going to shoot many, many people. And we can see that's it. I know that's really simplistic, but that's the dynamic that we end up working with. But people like Marshall Rosenberg, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, so many people around the world, peacemakers, have used these techniques and they have changed people's lives. And if we were more fluent in this, if it was something that more people learned, even beyond that kind of international global conflict kind of situation, we would simply have happier homes. We would simply have better relationships with our friends and family. We would simply be more at ease at work. Do you know what I mean? And like I say, not without conflict. It's not about living without conflict. It's about being able to have the tools to navigate conflict in a way that everyone can come out the other side, probably having learnt something, but being closer to having their needs met.
Surely that must be the lesson of conflict.
Yeah, it should be useful. It's a tool. It's like, that's that sort of, whenever we're uncomfortable, it's telling us something. So if I've been sitting on my bottom all day, which I have been for most of this morning because I had quite a long call prior to this, my body is telling me that things are aching a bit and are a bit sore. So that discomfort, that pain, is telling me to get up and move my body. So that's not a negative thing. That's a helpful reminder that things aren't quite right and I need to now go and do something differently. So in exactly the same way, when those uncomfortable feelings arise for us, see, we have this language about feelings being negative or positive. Don't we talk about negative feelings or bad feelings. They're not good or bad or negative or positive. They're all just telling us something about whether our needs are being met. And so we can just invite them all in for a cup of tea. Invite them all in. Because if you don't, because they're knocking on the door, then we can either let them in for a cup of tea calmly and have a bit of a chat and see what they want to tell us, or we can keep them outside the door. And they're knocking on the door and you're not letting them in. Well, they'll come round to the windows. You know what I mean? They'll start throwing stones at your windows because they want to be heard. They're trying to tell us something. So yeah, if whoever's listening to this, if you take away one thing, just stop with the good, bad, positive, negative feelings. They're just feelings. And when we let them in, they're just like a wave. They will come and they will go. But if you try and lock them out, they kind of, they kind of grow a bit. And we can get stuck in them then. So yeah, invite them in for a cup of tea.
I don't know where I heard that. What you resist persists.
Exactly that.
It's not going to go away.
It's not going to go away. It's the same as those conflicts in our lives, those patterns that we just like again and again and again. It might be with the same people, or as I was saying before, it might be with that narrative that we have in our own heads about ourselves, our own self-talk, our own little stories that we tell ourselves. There's a Brené Brown. I'm sure many people have heard Brené Brown talking about this, and she will talk about there's the thing that happened, and then there's the story you tell yourself about the thing that happened. And the thing that happened is often quite simple, but the story we tell ourselves can get really quite elaborate, and kind of taps into these internal narratives. So these kind of approaches, compassionate or nonviolent communication, can free us from a lot of that. It's not, I'm not going to say it's easy, because it isn't, and it's a bit clunky when you first start learning.
But it really, I think at this time where we're becoming more and more siloed, we're becoming more and more in our own echo chambers. And so, of course, we surround ourselves with people that feel the same.
Yes.
And so the conversations we're having are not pushing our buttons because we all feel the same.
Yes. Yeah.
So those overlapping ripples that you get from being with other people that have different beliefs and different cultural values and understandings and ideas, if that's not happening, then also we're not growing because we're shrinking in our own echo chamber by not experiencing different emotions. So, what's great about those, I mean, you can buy the cards. We're not making any money, Milly.
No.
But they also offer them for free. So, you can print them on little pieces of paper, which is what I did. And I cut them up myself. And if you want to get the professional cards, you can get the professional cards. But I think it's very interesting to really explore what are all these words. And, what do they feel like, those different words? Are you even aware of them? And so, yes, I think it's, these helpful tools which could potentially help us navigate this crazy world we're in right now to a different future is really where we need to go. So it's like focusing not on the problems, focusing on the solutions of what does the road forward look like and how can we potentially use this.
I was thinking as you were talking there about that idea of kind of silos and us sort of not communicating outside of those, around the permaculture design principle around edges and welcoming them, and valuing edges and the margins. And we have got to a point where we use that language around things being edgy or things being marginal as like something to be frightened of, something to avoid. And permaculture practice invites us to properly flip on its head and appreciate that where different ecosystems, which includes us as people, we're ecosystems, aren't we? Where we come together, those edges, if they're permeable, then that's where great stuff happens. That's where life really happens. So you've got these things kind of adapting to each other and learning how to be with each other. And I just always imagine that edge between sort of forest and grassland is really exciting. That edge between day and night. What happens at dusk and dawn? Ooh, there's stuff that goes on there at these edges. That little tidal overlap between the sea and the land. Stuff happens in that little strip. Doesn't happen in the sea. That doesn't happen, kind of way deep in the sand dunes. So this, and it is a little bit dangerous. You've got to have your wits about you. You've got to be, have all your senses a bit like, on alert. But don't you feel alive in that space, in those moments? And my God, you learn about yourself and your own kind of resources, your own resilience, your own capacities. You learn what you're lacking and what you might need to, kind of expand on. And then you learn about other cultures and other creatures and other ways of being. And we have lost the curiosity, I think, about that. largely. And I think that's really sad.
Yeah.
We can't go on being little separate bubbles. We dream
And still stuck
that up.
in the idea of, humans and nature. The
Yes,
idea still that nature is something out there. It's what you see behind me. It's the forest, it's the river, it's something different. And us humans, we're kind of like a different thing.
yeah,
And, and we back it up in so much of our language. So,
yes,
so many words we use without thinking really of their meaning. They just become part of our vocabulary in the way that we speak. And when we start to really listen at certain words, we're still talking about fighting climate change. And, there's just a lot of this language which just becomes part of the normal vocab. And do we need to start really looking at the words that we choose to use? So I don't know if you've got any other good examples of words.
yeah. I do. I do think about that a lot. That kind of fighting, tackling is the other one. I've got a real thing about, we are neither at war nor in a rugby match, right? Here, we're not tackling things. I know that tackling has a number of different meanings, and it is about kind of sort of addressing something that's a bit tricky and complex. But the imagery that we often have around tackling is to the ground. It's a rugby scrum kind of thing. It's like it's kind of not the right energy. And we're not fighting it. That there's been a lot of debate around that language in terms of disease, particularly cancer. When people talk about, somebody lost their battle. Wow, what huge responsibility that is to put on a person to fight something that we know has quite a high mortality rate, and that somehow you failed, you lost your battle. Do you know what I mean? So we're using that same language now with fighting climate change. It's like we can't fight it. It's not the right. It's not just not the right language. It's not the right metaphor. I
Yeah.
think. Yeah,
So
it's
hopefully this has kind of whetted people's appetite to
mm,
start exploring this different use of language and different kinds of communication. What is compassionate communication? Look up more about NVC and take yourself on a bit more of a journey to explore how we can think differently and actually think maybe like the rest of nature
mm,
and not separate from it. What would it look like? How does a tree think? How does a water boatman we were watching yesterday,
yeah,
who's quite intent on what they're doing? And so, and that communication that's happening all around us all the time. And, there's a lot we can learn from the communication of the world around us. So, humans, we have to keep remembering that we're a very young species and we haven't worked this stuff out yet. So any of these ways could be really useful. So I
I
don't know if
think
you've got anything else to add, Milly.
I will just say I will put in so when this goes out, whichever platform it goes out on, I'll try and make sure that if there are some notes that go along with this or a reference, to just point people in the direction of a couple of the classic books that Marshall Rosenberg wrote around nonviolent communication, and then there is also a companion workbook that goes along with that. And I think actually you can find free PDFs for that. And again, online, a lot of this stuff people who are working in this field want more people to have access to it, so they try and make it as accessible as possible. But the workbook is actually really handy in the way that it's written. So it's written so you can use it for your own personal development, or you can use it if you're working with a group. So it's written to kind of cover both of those options, and it takes you through that structure that I very, very briefly talked about earlier, of that observe without judgment, talk about feelings and not thoughts, and then talking about our needs and not strategies, making requests and not demands. So it takes you systematically through that process, and I would recommend it to anyone who would like, as I say, practicing in a group, or wants to just start their own journey. I do run online courses. I'll probably be doing another one in the autumn, and which they're usually promoted through Sarah Spencer's Think Like a Tree platform. But any way that people can do this. I did training myself with Jill and Richard Broadbent in the Centre for Compassionate Communication in London. I believe they're still running courses, they're still writing books, they're tremendous, really lovely teachers, very wise, experienced couple. So there are lots of places that we can learn about this, but the main thing is just to practice and start with that sort of self-reflection, I think, of getting ourselves in a place where we understand our own needs and can voice our feelings, and practice on small stuff. You don't all have to go to Israel or Palestine, okay, on your first lesson. You can just think about that person who cut you up at the roundabout, and, and start there in terms of kind of, you know, how you think about them and how you perceive what happened. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Milly. That's been great. Lot of food for thought.
Okay.
And yeah, I will definitely put all the links in the notes afterwards.
Thank you.
So thank you so much and look forward to next time.
Okay, thanks for your
Bye.
time.
Bye.
Bye now.